Before dawn on a quiet Sunday, Leonard Francis surveyed the empty rooms of his 5-bedroom house. The streets of the San Diego gated community where he lived were still. It was from this office, on an upper floor of the home, that Leonard had talked to me for over 25 hours last year for this podcast, after we smuggled in a microphone. Now everything was gone. The furniture, his clothes, his 3 young teenage children, and even the microphone we'd sent him. He sat down in the empty living room and with a pair of scissors severed a GPS-enabled monitoring device from his ankle. He opened a plastic water cooler and placed the device inside. Then Leonard put the scissors on top and walked out of the house into a waiting SUV. When Leonard cut through his ankle device, an alarm was set off at pretrial services in San Diego. They alerted Leonard's lawyers, who went to the house. The lawyers knocked, but there was no answer. So they called the U.S. Marshals. The Marshals didn't arrive until 4 p.m., a full 7 hours after Leonard had fled.
We went to the house that afternoon, knocked on the door, no answer. Looking through the windows, it looked pretty vacant. Found an unlocked door, and my task force officers went in.
Entering the house, officers found the water cooler sitting there in the empty living room, the GPS monitoring bracelet inside.
Finding out about the U-Haul trucks and knowing that the house was empty, he's had some time to plan this out. So we are definitely leaning towards him possibly being on the international side.
The Marshals radioed in. They had a fugitive on their hands, suspected to have fled over the border into Mexico.
U.S. Marshals revealed the man at the center of the biggest bribery scandal in Navy history has escaped.
Call him Fat Leonard. This is a wild one.
The U.S. Marshals Service confirms Leonard Francis escaped his house arrest over the weekend.
Less than 3 weeks before his sentencing in one of the biggest public corruption scandals in the U.S. military history.
Authorities say he removed his GPS monitoring ankle bracelet on Sunday. When officers arrived at his home, they found it empty.
Arrested in 2013, Leonard had absconded just 3 weeks before his sentencing date. A corrupt Navy contractor, he provided food, fuel, and security to the Navy for 3 decades. But he'd also supplied prostitutes, fine wines, and cigars. And in return, the Navy padded contracts by tens of millions of dollars. Almost 20 Navy officers, including an admiral, had gone to jail or were awaiting sentencing in the Fat Leonard affair. Leonard himself had pleaded guilty, his cooperation helping to convict many of them. After contracting cancer, he'd been allowed into home detention 5 years earlier. Now it was his turn to face sentencing. He was facing a possible 25 years in jail. U-Haul removal trucks had arrived a few days earlier. His 3 teenage children had left with his mother. The private security guards stationed outside his home believed Leonard was moving out ahead of his sentencing on September 22. But Leonard had other plans. Kristina Davis, a journalist, has followed the Fat Leonard story for years.
I mean, the thing that the marshals were very clear on was that he had planned this for a long time. This was very planned. This was not just a rash decision.
Why would Leonard go on the run after cooperating with the government for so many years and so close to his sentencing? Kristina has a theory. Just a few days earlier, his lawyers had received Leonard's pre-trial sentencing documents.
The docket on Leonard's case shows that the pre-sentence report was filed in his case. I think it's right near the end of August. And then he went on the lam just, a week and a half, 2 weeks later? And maybe he was very surprised at what he read. I mean, that's just one thing we're wondering, if something in that pre-sentence report scared him.
Back last year, when I spoke at length to Leonard, he often said he thought he'd get off with time served. He'd already been in detention for almost a decade.
Well, I've already done my time. Even if they give me 12 years, it's time served. Do you understand? If
you've been there 8 years.
Yeah, but with good time, if you count that off, how many months I get off, and then all my corporation, it's all shaved off. I mean, you should understand how the U.S. legal system works.
But something had changed. That conversation in September last year was the last I had with Leonard. Since then, the podcast had come out. In it, Leonard talks about how he bribed Navy officers. He explained how he felt a scapegoat, rotting in jail for years, while admirals who took favors from him and helped him prosper got off scot-free. It's certainly true that despite the graft, Leonard did a good job servicing the Navy, and admirals knew about the corruption.
I'm so upset, that, I'm portrayed as the bad guy when I wasn't the bad guy. I did everything that they wanted me to do.
Leonard talked to me because he wanted to get his story out, but he changed his mind at the last minute. He wanted to pull the podcast, but I refused. He figured it might anger US prosecutors, and he was probably right. The government clearly didn't like that he'd talked to us. They haven't said as much, but they pulled Leonard as the key witness in the trials of other Navy officers, a sign they now saw him as a liability. So Leonard, sitting in his San Diego home, decided going on the run was preferable to doing more time in jail. Back in San Diego, the Marshals Service had egg on its face. How did Leonard get away so easily? He was supposed to be under 24/7 guard at his home, but it was a strange arrangement. Trying to save money, the court had ordered Leonard to cover the costs of the security himself. Back in December 2020, the federal court judge who was overseeing Leonard's case chastised his lawyers for an incident in which a court official had visited the house and found it unguarded. Now, authorities were giving no details of what had gone wrong.
The government has refused to give us the name of the private security company he had hired to guard him at his house while he was under house arrest. Like pretty much everything dealing with his conditions under house arrest, they've been under seal in the court records for years.
Maybe he paid off the guards. Or maybe they were incompetent. What's for sure is that he was over the border into Mexico before US authorities even had a clue he was missing.
So you've got from 7:30 in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon that Francis has had the time. I mean, he was probably over the border, the Mexico border from his house in about inside of 30 minutes, on a Sunday morning, on a holiday weekend. I mean, wide open freeways, go right through.
The US Marshals put a $40,000 bounty on Leonard, but he was nowhere to be found. From Mexico, Leonard, accompanied by his adult son Leonardo, had taken a plane to Cuba, and a few days later, another flight, this time to Venezuela. It was the middle of the night in London when Bradley Hope, my colleague, called me in Singapore. He'd received an incredible piece of news. We had information that Leonard was in Venezuela. We can't discuss how we knew, but we were right, and we published his location in our newsletter, Whale Hunting. Venezuela was only supposed to be a pit stop. After a couple of days in a hotel in Caracas, the capital, Leonard headed back to the airport. Here's Carlos Camacho, a Venezuelan journalist who followed the story.
He goes to the Simon Bolivar International Airport in an effort to catch a flight to Margarita Island. What's happening in Margarita Island? It's an island that's 45 minutes from the mainland, pretty secluded, tourism heaven, and it has direct flights to Russia. The reports we have is that he was trying to get to Russia.
Leonard would have been a valuable asset for Russia. He knew the inner workings of the Navy, and he had sexual compromat, photos and videos of US Navy officers engaged in lewd sexual acts. Before Leonard was arrested, he'd been courted by the Russian defense attaché.
I met the Russian defense attaché as a colonel a couple of times in receptions. Then he found out where I lived, and he would just come by uninvited to drop gifts to me, vodka and stuff like that.
But Leonard wouldn't get to Russia. As he tried to board that flight, he was arrested. The US had put out an Interpol red notice, and apparently Leonard had not been careful enough. The US had been able to track him via a cell phone number, and Interpol was waiting.
Apparently, they were tracking some cell phone traffic or a cell phone number or something like that that led them to either Venezuela or to a particular neighborhood in Venezuela.
Right, and that would be extremely poor security planning if you were on the run and you were using a cell phone that was able to be tracked by the US authorities, right? I mean, you'd think you would be off cell phones or off email, right?
Yeah, it does make me question exactly his strategy.
The head of Venezuela's Interpol office gave details of the arrest on his Instagram page. In a photo, Leonard looked disheveled, wearing a windbreaker and a flower-patterned tracksuit, big bags under his eyes. The official wrote that Leonard would be handed over to the judicial system to begin extradition proceedings. The government of President Nicolás Maduro, however, had other ideas. The US doesn't recognize Maduro's government, and the president saw Leonard as a political bargaining chip. A few days after his arrest, a state-owned newspaper, a mouthpiece for the government, said Leonard had requested political asylum.
First, Interpol, gave us the news. He's going to be handed over. Now the government is telling us, no, wait a minute. He has requested asylum. What I think is going to happen to him is what has happened to every American in Maduro custody. They're going to cat and mouse with him, toy with him for a while until they get some sort of, break from the Biden administration. This is going to develop into some sort of trade. Maduro is going to engage in some sort of horse trading to do this, right?
Who could Maduro want in return? My money is on Alex Saab, a man currently in jail in Florida on money laundering charges, who has shadowy ties to Maduro. The Venezuelan government has repeatedly asked for his return. The Biden administration, however, is unlikely to trade.
It's such a politically fraught situation, too, because even the mere act of requesting extradition to Maduro's regime basically is a signal legitimizing Maduro's regime. So it's a can of worms.
So how will the Fat Leonard story end? Will he release the sexual compromat? Will the new attention on the national security aspects of this case and a possible Russian play for Leonard finally lead to a US congressional investigation? The fact Leonard was trying to get to Russia should raise concern. But I doubt anyone in Congress will take this up. The cover-up at the Navy has worked, and now Leonard is gone. Leonard had always lived a colorful life. Now he's looking at extended exile in a country that often has power outages and water shortages. It will be a very different life from the one he lived in San Diego, and a world away from his heyday, living in a $130 million mansion in Singapore with 20 luxury cars.
This is a corrupt man. He's accustomed to a certain lifestyle, which has been amply documented by US and international media. If he has enough money, he will be able to obtain something resembling that lavish lifestyle he was accustomed to. But somehow I don't see it, Tom. Not in Venezuela, not right now.
Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for more series from Project Brazen Originals in the months to come. And as always, you can follow our latest reporting in our newsletter, Whale Hunting.